Hi. Have you ever wondered about the magic of color? Have you ever wondered about how color can powerfully impact our moods and help change our lives? Well, in this episode of The Tie-Dyed Therapist, we're going to be focusing on one of my favorite wisdom cards, which is called Color Me Happy. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining me today. Color Me Happy is one of my favorite wisdom cards because there's a whole story behind it. And I've thought about it many times over the years, and I wanted to share the story with you. But first, I should probably give you a little bit of a backdrop or, understanding of how this all came to be. So in the early 1980s, I had gone to college for the first time and flunked out the first year. And it was really a combination of not paying attention to my studies and lack of concentration and really not knowing how to study. But nevertheless, I had flunked out of college, I lost my scholarship, and I didn't have the ability to go right back to school. And so I ended up taking a job at this place called the Salvation Army homeless shelter. And the homeless shelter was based in Laramie, Wyoming, where I went to school. And it was above a thrift shop that the Salvation Army also owned. The store and the homeless shelter were right up against a set of railroad tracks that went through Laramie. And so you can imagine it wasn't the best of neighborhoods. Anyway, my job was to manage this shelter, and it was an overnight shelter, meaning that any time that the Laramie Police Department wanted to drop transient people off to my shelter, they could do so. And typically, they did this at all times of the night. So I would frequently get calls at midnight, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. Any time that they found somebody who had been hitchhiking or they were transient, they came off of the train, something had happened and they needed shelter and they needed a place to stay. So in those days, in the early 1980s, and even before that, hitchhiking was a really common thing. I mean, people would hitchhike across the country all the time. And very rarely would they ever get picked up by the police. And so in those days, a lot of people that didn't have jobs, a lot of people that were homeless, that were out on the street, they were traveling from warmer climates to cooler climates and vice versa. So in other words, people would come through Wyoming as they had already spent their winter in Florida. And then they would spend their summer, in the western states, and particularly California, looking for work. This was a very frequent thing that happened. And my job at the homeless shelter was to make sure that they had a bed, make sure that, they had food, clothing voucher if necessary, trying to just take care of some basic needs before they moved on. The thing about this shelter that I noticed immediately through my 19-year-old eyes was how drab and dreary and depressing it looked. The whole thing was literally painted in institutional beige. And if you've ever seen institutional beige, you know what a drag that can be. So it depressed me. It certainly depressed the people coming in. It felt very oppressive. And one of the first things that I did, kind of instinctively, was I took some of the money that I made from the homeless shelter and I went to the paint store. And being 19, I chose the brightest, absolutely brightest, vivid colors I could find. So I found magenta and bright blue and this sunshine yellow that I love so much, and really bright white paint for the woodwork. And the next thing that I did was I had some of the homeless people that came through that wanted to stay a couple of days or more. I had them stay with me, and I had them help me paint the rooms of the homeless shelter. And so this color, this bright sunshine yellow, ended up in a room that was called the Women and Children's Dorm. And it faced the east, so in the morning, when the sun came up, it completely illuminated this room with this yellow color. It was amazing what it did. And, you know, other rooms were painted the magenta and the blue and green and whatever else I could find that I wanted to brighten up the place. And I noticed something really interesting when those rooms got painted and people started walking in off the street. First of all, I watched changes in their facial expressions. I noticed how their eyes lit up. I noticed how their mood shifted, how they treated me. You know, initially, when people would come in to the shelter, they didn't know who they were getting. They didn't know if I was going to be mean to them. They didn't know if I was going to abuse them in some ways. They had no idea. I was a perfect stranger to them. And when they saw these rooms transformed, literally, by color, they started acting differently. Now, of course, years later, I find out that this really has to do with color theory, and there's a whole thing in psychology about how color impacts mood. But at the time, I didn't know any of that. All I knew was I wanted something brighter, happier, lighter, something that I could be comfortable sitting in. And of course, all these people needed the same thing as well. So the reason that I include Color Me Happy in my wisdom card deck was that I wanted everyday people to know how important color is in our life and to not take it for granted. Everybody has a favorite color or a set of colors that they like more than anything. And if you look in people's wardrobes, you'll find those colors. You'll also find those colors throughout their homes. And sometimes people will tell me in therapy that they're wearing a particular item because it makes them feel better. It might be an old sweater, but they love the purple color in the sweater. They love how it feels, but most importantly, they love how it looks and what associations they make with it. These are all really important basic things that really help people in their moods. And in fact, when people are really depressed and I end up talking to them in therapy, the subject of color does come up once in a while, because with a lot of people, they're so influenced by the colors that they see, the art that's on the walls, anything that's creative, anything that's colorful. They're so impacted by this that it literally is a very easy way to start to maybe alleviate some of that depression that people are having. So anyway, Color Me Happy makes me happy, and it has for a very long time. And I hope that if you ever pull this card or you ever think about this subject of Color Me Happy, you'll remember the story and you'll remember how important it is to treat yourself to the magic of color. Thanks for watching The Tie-Dyed Therapist. Until next time, bye.